Welcome to another session of our weekly series, our Tertulia Talk series, a series that Latin American Studies does with predominantly UCSD faculty. It's our pleasure to introduce Professor Matthew Vitz from the Department of History. Professor Vitz has been here in the History Department for several years. He teaches modern environmental history with the focus on Mexico and Mexico City. Professor Vitz has previously held appointments and postdocs at Dartmouth University. You were a fellow at the UCSD U.S Mexican Center for a short period of time, a postdoc fellow also at UNAM. And he is known for his book on the environmental history of Mexico City, City on a Lake, Urban Political Ecology and the Growth of Mexico City. Matt is going to give us some remarks today on his work, and then we'll have a period of time to have some open discussion and question and answers. So without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Vitz.
All right. Thanks, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you today. I think last time I was in this room was maybe way back when I arrived. I think it was 2015 or 16, and Christine Hunefeld, who's sitting right over there, had invited me to do this sort of same kind of thing in the Latin American Studies Master, Lati 200. I'm gonna give sort of a general overview of my research from the book that I published in 2018 to some newer projects. And so I guess, I'll start out with kind of trying to define myself as a historian. And for so long, right, historians I think feel the need to define themselves, their approach, like what kind of historian are you? And so Jody mentioned an environmental historian. And I think that, so for a long time I was like, oh, are you a cultural historian? Are you a political historian? Are you an environmental historian, a diplomatic historian, and so on and so forth? I think, over the last maybe 10 to 15 years in the discipline of history, there's been a lot of blurring of boundaries and a blurring of fields. So there's kind of less of a need to do that kind of identification. But sure, I'm an environmental historian, although I'm an environmental historian who has been deeply influenced by approaches and methods of cultural history, of political history, of the history of science and technology. So my research, my work really sort of lies at the intersection of a lot of those different fields. And when I say environmental history, I'm referring to sort of very broadly speaking non-human worlds. Okay, so that's like what we would call nature, right? The sort of, you think of like biophysical elements, water, plants, organisms, microorganisms, but also like sort of built environments, right? Human-made infrastructures and artifice. I guess in terms of, I'll talk a little bit about some of my theoretical influences. Maybe historians tend to do this a little bit less than than scholars in other fields sort of talk about theory, but theory has been very important in my sort of academic and intellectual formation. I did grad work in my Ph.D. in the aughts. And as a historian of Mexico and Latin America, it was basically impossible to avoid talking about Gramsci. So Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist theorist, was very important in my kind of intellectual formation, particularly his thinking around questions of politics and class, questions of hegemony, and sort of political coalitions and the ways in which elites rule over citizens or over subject populations in highly unequal social arrangements. So Gramsci was super influential. political ecology, so the sort of critical geography of resource uses, of thinking about environments in sort of political terms as arrangements of power, and an offshoot of political ecology is urban political ecology. So there's a wide, sort of like a really large amount of scholarship now on urban political ecology, which basically kind of looks at the power relationships in urban nature and in urban built environments. So how urban nature is made by power and political economic forces, and how power relationships sort of also make or are made by urban nature, right? So the sort of co-constitutive dynamic between what we might call sort of urban nature and sort of the arrangements of power in a city. Maybe I'll say a few words about kind of my method as a historian. I think the sort of the typical, or one of the kind of typical stories you'll hear when historians talk about method is like, well, what do you mean method? You know, like I have a question that I'm interested in and I go to the archives and I like dig into the archives and I try to answer the question, and I have like, you know, I'll just go from document to document as kind of like a detective meandering between archives and different collections until I sort of come up with an answer. And so there's a sort of, I think, a kind of sort of understanding that historians just aren't very methodical with their method, aren't very intentional with their method, and so I kind of want to sort of emphasize the way I think about historical change, right? It's sort of my sort of method of interpreting or understanding historical change and causation. And so sort of the historian's craft is very much about explaining change over time, explaining causation. That's kind of like one of the sort of the bread and butter of the historical endeavor. Along with, I would say, you know, more recently especially, concerns that historians have with experiences, right? People's experiences and how, you know, people gave meaning to those historical changes. So sort of the more cultural history, emphasis on meaning making, identity, and experiences in sort of particular historical moments. But I want to talk mostly about sort of like how I think about causation and change over time, and it kind of brings together my environmental history approach and the sort of political history approach. So, you know, some of the social sciences, you know, particularly like political science, maybe, you know, also we could include some sociology in there. There's a tendency to kind of emphasize or try to isolate variables. Like, you know, you have your dependent variables and your independent variables, and you try to isolate the causes. And, you know, not to knock scholars, researchers who do that. I think it's very valid in a lot of cases. But at least for thinking historically, historians, and myself included, right, we tend to sort of think about the ecology of variables, right? Sort of interconnecting factors, interdependent relationships, rather than the sort of work of isolating. And so my particular method is more in line with what we might call kind of assemblage thinking or networked thinking. So I borrow a lot from, in my work, from, if you're familiar with actor network theory, the sort of ideas that Bruno Latour and other historians of science and other sort of political ecologists have articulated, that emphasizes the sort of assemblages of what they would call actors or actants that are both human and non-human, that sort of create a particular reality, right? So there's in this sort of assemblage thinking or network thinking, non-human entities can also become sort of agents. Although the emphasis is on how they're agents or how they become sort of active through social relations, right? Not outside social relationships. Okay. So there's a kind of emphasis in this on how sort of causal entities constitute one another in a historical process, okay? And so here's another, this sort of leads me to another point I want to make about my method, is that I like to think dialectically. So are people familiar with dialectics as a kind of theory of society, right? So for those of you who are familiar with dialectics, so what would dialectical thinking or dialectical history be?
So it's an understanding of history as conflict of different perspectives, or as motion between different perspectives. Mm-hmm. And using a Marxist approach, at least you would have a system that's in place and it has its own internal conflicts or contradictions that would create its demise, and then a synthesis would appear from that, and that's a constant movement. At least that's how I understand it.
Yeah. So in Marx, the sort of traditional Marxist historical materialism, right? There's a sort of the class analysis is the historical class analysis that you have the sort of antagonism, antithesis, and thesis, and then you have a synthesis resulting from those contradictory forces. And so you can't understand, the basic idea is that you can't understand those two entities as separate, right? They kind of co-constitute each other in a set of historical relationships. And so that's the kind of crass materialist way of thinking about dialectics. But I think there's a more sort of general kind of universal way in which we can use dialectical thinking of kind of taking anything that sort of appears to be a binary or separate in some way, and actually bringing them together and thinking historically about how they constitute each other. So that could be like practice and ideology, or local and global, like local force and global forces. It could be sort of race and class, right? So I think in some way we could think about racial capitalism, right? This sort of big concept that historians and social scientists have really developed over the last couple decades as a kind of result or a kind of reality, a social reality that's made from these sort of forces that are in constant sort of interaction with one another historically. Meaning like class and capitalism and sort of racial hierarchies and colonialism, right? So you kind of like the historical interconnections between those two forces that seem to be, if not opposed, then at least separate, right? And you see how they become interlocked, and that you can't understand one without the other. So another, in my case, right, a big one is sort of city and nature, or culture and nature, right? These sort of seemingly opposed entities that in fact are in dialectical relationship to one another, and that you can't really understand them separately, right? Okay. And then, I find has anybody, are you familiar with the work of William Sewell, who's a historian and social scientist? He wrote a book called Logics of History. And so as a kind of political scientist slash sociologist slash historian, he was trying to, in this book, Logics of History, kind of develop a theory of historical change that is implicit in a lot of historical works, but that doesn't really, but that historians don't really develop on their own, because, as I talked about before, historians tend to like shy away from thinking theoretically. So just to kind of give you a sense of how he interprets historical change, he makes a point about social sciences in general that a lot of the work that social scientists do is about understanding why structures, big social structures endure, like how they're durable over time, like sort of over time, how they reproduce themselves. And so what Sewell ends up sort of doing in this book is explaining that a kind of historical method that I've kind of laid out here, right? One in which history as these ecologies of interacting variables and dialectical relationships can give us a theory of not just how structures endure, but how structures change, right? So in other words, like if the bread and butter of history is explaining historical change, explaining change over time, we're really talking about, in some sense, we're talking about how structures change, right? Whether that be like capitalism or race or gender relationships and patriarchy and so on down the list, right? Like historians are really attuned in trying to explain these kinds of changes over time. And so Sewell has this really useful theory of the relationship between structure and agency, which I think oftentimes it gets kind of pitted as a binary, right? As like a dualism, like there's structure over here and there's agency over here. And he says, well, this is pretty inaccurate, right? In the sense that it's not an either or, right? That structures are actually reproduced through agency, that people make particular decisions within a structural relationship. And that structures come about through agency. And also that agency becomes possible, right? Historical agency becomes possible within what he calls the tensions of competing structures, right? And so I think it's a really fascinating theory, and that agency becomes possible through historical contingencies. Certain events that happen that were kind of like not determined that they were going to happen. Could be like even a sort of natural, sort of quote unquote natural thing, like an earthquake or a hurricane, or what have you. Okay. So he has this theory of the historical event as leading to large-scale structural change. So events themselves become meaningful in accounts of historical change when those events disrupt or transform structures that otherwise seem to inexorably reproduce themselves. So he uses the example, he's a historian of the French Revolution, so he uses the example of the storming of the Bastille, right, in 1789. So this really critical event in European history. So he goes into sort of like thinking about like the relationship between structure and agency and contingent events that then cascade into sort of a large structural change that happens in the nation of France. Okay, so that's sort of like theoretical, methodological overview of how I see or how I do history and how I see its sort of usefulness. So let me take some time to sort of dive into some research projects, and I'll start with my book that came out in 2018, A City on a Lake: Urban Political Ecology and the Growth of Mexico City. There's going to be, I'm happy to announce, for those of you who would rather read it in Spanish, there's going to be a Spanish translation of it coming out in Mexico in a couple weeks, actually. So that's very cool. This is a kind of political, ecological, or environmental history of Mexico City and its environs. So like the surrounding hinterland. Mexico City located in a closed basin, the Basin of Mexico. So I want to rather than kind of like give a kind of book talk where I would sort of go over the argument and the contributions, and I kind of want to talk more about the process of how I developed this topic, and how I kind of came to see the argument that I wanted to make. So I started out, this was 2005, 2006. I was in grad school and I got a Tinker Fellowship, that many grad students are able to get to do like a month-long research in Mexico City. But my idea was, just to give you a sense of like, I didn't have this idea from the start to write this kind of book or do this kind of dissertation. My idea was to kind of try to write a history of the politics of Mexico City during the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920, kind of focusing on migration of people from the countryside during the late 19th century, during the Mexican Revolution, to try to kind of understand the political culture of the city, a city of a lot of migrants, in relationship to like, the major forces of the revolution. So like, what was the support like for Zapatistas in the city? What was the support like for, these different sort of political forces of the revolution? And that project completely fell through. It turns out it's really, really hard to get at these questions, right? And to sort of write this history of migration and political culture in the way I wanted to. So when I was doing the kind of preliminary research of going into archives and be like, okay, what kinds of collections are here on Mexico City? I kept coming across all of these collections related to the environment. And sure, I always was kind of very interested in environmental topics and environmental history, but it was not at all my training. Like my training was political history, histories of revolution, histories of empire, like NYU, New York University, like 2000s. It was like a very different training than what I ended up doing. But I found all of these incredible collections, and I said, like, this is really fascinating in the sense that, I could kind of delve into one of my main interests, which was I'm interested in urban-rural relationships, right? So now it was like, okay, I can look at these relationships through an environmental political lens or an ecological lens rather than one of sort of the politics of migration. So I found that, and that was like a hook for me. And as I was digging through a lot of these sources and archives, I was also trying to sort of read newspapers and read like, Nexos and like El Proceso, like these major Mexico City newspapers and magazines. And there too, it was like people are talking about water, they're talking about forests and ecosystems. And the narrative is like the Valley of Mexico, the Basin of Mexico, is an ecological catastrophe, right? It's been poorly managed, it's been poorly planned, it's an ecology in ruins, it's desequilibrada, there's no equilibrium or harmonious relationship with nature. And then I realized like this kind of narrative has been going on for a while. Like all the way back to the 1940s and 50s. So here's, these various sort of artistic visual art works that show sort of like, Mexico City as this disaster zone, right? So here's showing a dust storm outside of Mexico City, and like people playing in what appears to be like a drainage, sort of drainage infrastructure that's gone missing or something. And then this also, like, this is from 1947, an artist who's looking forward, sort of looking ahead in Mexico City to in 1970, right? And it's like this disaster zone, right? And this seemed like a premonition in a lot of senses, right? Because this is 1947, Mexico City is still rather small in comparison to what it would become. And then I started reading like Carlos Monsiváis, and his essays on like the Mexico City is not apocalyptic, it's like truly post-apocalyptical. There were all these narratives about how Mexico City had bulldozed communities. It was like subjugating nature, and it had become this kind of catastrophe. So first I was like, oh wow, this is pretty incredible. Like I have all this archival material to explain how Mexico City got into the mess that it was currently found itself. To kind of explain, I can historically explain Mexico City's decline. All right, so that's how I sort of first started asking, like those are the first questions that provided the sort of impetus for my research. But then, and this gives you a sense of like how things can change, right? How your research questions change, how your perspectives change. As I began to actually dig into the material in the archives, a whole set of like, to me, new and more interesting questions emerged, more interesting thoughts on the matter. I started, to wonder, like, why did so many people kind of articulate this sort of ecological consciousness of Mexico City, pretty early on when we're talking about the history of environmentalism, right? Particularly urban environmental questions. Like, why did they have this kind of urban environmentalism in Mexico City when it didn't seem to exist really anywhere else at the time? I was interested more in like the construction of the narrative rather than giving it a kind of face value truth, okay? And so, my research was indicating that this kind of one-sided story of subjugation and ruin was not so accurate, right? That it wasn't such a straightforward, simple story. And that I kind of came to just kind of have the interpretation that this narrative of Mexico City's decline was kind of like a microcosm of Mexico City's larger political history that people were starting to sort of develop a very profound critique of the PRI in the 1970s and 1980s. And so it kind of was like a mirror image of this bigger, a microcosm of this bigger narrative and discourse about how the PRI was ruining, sort of like ruining Mexico and subjugating people and, ruling with an iron fist. And so I kind of came to see that the city's struggles were symbolizing the sort of broader political dilemmas of the nation. And in fact, what I was finding in the archive were a lot of stories of planning, right? A lot of stories of environmental planning, a lot of stories of environmental conflict, of social struggles over particular spaces, over particular sort of aquatic environments or forested environments and urban spaces. So I began to see like, oh, this is actually there's an alternative history here, right? There's a different history here of not just sort of like pure subjugation, but of negotiation and struggle. And struggles that, today we might call them environmental justice movements, but struggles that in some cases were like quote unquote successful, right? That resulted in sort of successful claims to resources, successful claims to spaces, that resulted in a sort of form of community sort of empowerment, and so on. So, kind of the theoretical framework of Gramsci, of the sort of actor network theory of thinking about like vibrant non-human natures being active forces in the world, of urban political ecology, sort of gave me the analytical and conceptual tools to tell a new sort of history of Mexico City and of the basin of Mexico. And so I had the tools to kind of analyze how political claims on the environment, especially those made during and after the Mexican Revolution of 1910, right? How those, that is to say, how those political claims intersected with the environment. So urban sanitary infrastructures like water and sewer systems, energy systems, urban land, forests, and water ecosystems. And that in turn, those environments, right, there was a kind of like the transformations that had taken place because of the growth of the environmental transformations that had taken place kind of also allowed nature to speak back, right? And you can see it, in these images, right? These dust storms that would ravage Mexico City because of the draining of the lakes was part of that sort of process of the environment speaking back. And here's an image that shows you sort of the lakes receding over time in the Valley of Mexico. So I was able to reveal how these environmental struggles involving all kinds of different people in the city. So urban experts, state officials, developers, popular classes, how these struggles shaped the growth of the city and ultimately led to a city that was widely interpreted as a social and ecological monstrosity. And then, moreover, I was able to bring into view the foreclosed and now mostly forgotten kind of what I would call alternative pathways of urban environmental governance, of urban environmental practices that, while forgotten and foreclosed, have left their mark on the landscapes and on the political culture of the city, and that in turn have much to teach us about the possibilities of sustainable and more democratic urbanism, right? City making and city design. And just, I don't know if people are familiar with the whole controversy over the Mexico City airport. Recently it was a huge sort of pet project, mega project of Peña Nieto, the former president, on the outskirts of Lake Texcoco, so around a little bit north, near Atenco there, in the sort of northeast corner of this map, in the Lake Texcoco bed, right? So this project was part of a long history of engineers and others kind of fighting over the resources of the lake bed. And so this project sort of fit into this longer history of we have to develop the lake bed for the needs of the city. And it turned into this huge controversy because you had the Atenco campesinos rising up, but you also had urban residents, environmentalists, conservationists who were like, no, like you're building this airport on a lake. It's not ecologically viable, even though they said it was an environmental project. It's not environmentally viable. It's gonna it's not gonna work out. It's gonna flood constantly. And they started saying, no, what we have to do is we have to recuperate the lake. We have to bring the lake back, right? So it's sort of those histories of different sort of forms of thinking about the Lake Texcoco bed that I talk about in the book, that really I think sheds new light on understanding this sort of longer context, this longer process of trying to remake the lake. Okay, so I have right now a couple projects that I'm working on, and maybe I'll just focus my attention on, I guess the one that I'm more excited about. But I'll just say briefly that I'm working on this this digital book it's part of a Cambridge series on global urban history. And so I guess it's tentatively titled Globalizing Urban Environmental History, which is kind of a mouthful. But in any case, it's the idea is to kind of write urban environmental history within a global register. And so it was a project that I was able to do in the midst of a pandemic when archives were closed. It's a project that allows me to do a lot of sort of synthetic interpretive work of historiography of scholarship. And it's and interestingly, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about my teaching, but for those of you who are interested in learning a bit about environmental history, I'm teaching in the winter for the second time a global environmental history seminar. And so this, interestingly, I think a lot of faculty would say our research sort of nourishes or influences our teaching. In a way, I think the opposite happened for this project. I taught this global environmental history seminar, and it kind of led me to this project of writing this sort of this book on urban environmental history. So I'll take a few. I'm happy to talk more about that project if you're interested in the discussion part. But I'm starting to work on the second book project that's tentatively titled "Development's Discontents: Ecology, Participatory Urbanism, and Indigenous Rights in Late 20th Century Mexico." And so in many ways, this project is a logical continuation of this first book. That the first book kind of ended in the 1950s, but it has an epilogue where I try to explain the rise of a kind of late 20th century urban environmentalism that was kind of ambivalent, or a kind of Janus-faced critique of modernization, or what we would call kind of the developmentalist paradigm. In some ways it was very sort of anti-development, anti-modernization. In other ways it kind of reproduced the basic kind of tenets of modernization. But maybe I'll ask you, like, when I say like modernization or developmentalism, is that what comes to mind when I say those two words? What would sort of be the process by which modernization happens? And then like what would be the outcome?
Basically erasing history and culture of native communities and establishing this path towards like civilization and homogenizing culturally, socially, but also about the practices and the beliefs as well.
That's right. So it's a kind of, it comes out of post-colonial thinking, it comes out of the Cold War. In some ways it's kind of continuation of the civilizing mission of colonial, the sort of the colonial imperialist projects of Europe of the 19th century, early 20th century. But meant to kind of be more neutral on questions of race. Right, so it's like, suddenly you have all these decolonized nations. They're backwards like they've always been, because the model is the sort of high consumer, high industrial capitalist societies of Western Europe and the United States. And so in the midst of the Cold War, in order to sort of stave off communism, in order to bring those countries, you want to bring those countries into modernity, right, into sort of the modern world. And you do that through technical know-how, through cooperation between sort of Western experts in the US and Western Europe, and the sort of the elites of these, new countries, or in cases, rather old Latin American countries at this point, but that were equally seen as being underdeveloped, right? So it creates this sort of hierarchy of nations based on, the sort of the level of the advance of industrial capitalism, of consumerism, of infrastructural development as well. And it still has these kind of, the debris of, if you will, a kind of debris of coloniality, of racism and coloniality, right? Because there's this hierarchy and a sort of implicit understanding that development, right, you have to develop indigenous peoples or non-white peoples so that they become sort of the true modern national citizens that they need to become. And so there's an environmental component to this too, which is, in order to be civilized, in order to be modern, those nations have to be able to conquer nature, right? Nature has to be subjugated. It has to be turned into a bundle of resources that can then flow into production, okay? So this project that I'm working on kind of looks at this period of what I want to do is look at this period from the 1960s to the 1980s, where in Mexico, and I want to kind of put it in this sort of global register, like global context as well, there's a wide array of professionals, scientists, anthropologists, urban planners and architects, as well as, you know, sort of popular groups, indigenous groups, urban residents who live on the peripheries of major cities, who, you know, in some cases they're working together, these professionals with these popular groups. And the way I see it is they begin to present a pretty radical critique of the basic tenets and practices of state-led modernization, right? So the sort of major, you know, infrastructural projects and major development programs. That includes also indigenismo, right, as a modernization program. And so I see that there are these three realms where where people are kind of presenting this critique of development. You see it in cities, particularly Mexico City. You see it in the realm of ecology and environment, and in the question of indigeneity. So I kind of want to look at these three realms and trace their intersections and trace the influences that this critique had on people's lives and how they saw themselves as, you know, different kinds of agents, different kinds of citizens. So, you know, we might think of, like, you know, some of these communities and some of these different ambits. You have people who are trying to kind of articulate their place in development as not people to be in which development happens to, right? But rather actors in their own sort of making of their worlds. So, you know, folks who are like where it's about empowering local actors, empowering local knowledges, right? So much of it's like sort of a debate over who has the expertise to develop, right? Sort of there's a kind of critique of the epistemology of development. Where folks are advancing new forms of citizenship, like eco-citizenship, environmental citizenship, indigenous citizenship, you know, sort of urban settler citizenship, where the emphasis is on, you know, different forms of largely autonomous self-government, right? So autogestión would be the word in Spanish. And there's an emphasis more and more on sort of protecting kind of national, cultural, and biological patrimony, right? And so those are some of the sort of main kind of areas of how these people sort of advance the critique of this modernization paradigm. And so the kind of larger contribution that I see here is that what this might offer is a kind of new story of political change in late 20th century Mexico, where we tend to get this sort of narrative, this sort of historical narrative of, you know, the state-led project, the import substitution industrialization project of modernization exhausted itself, it failed. You had a moment where you had leftists, you know, in the mountains of Guerrero and elsewhere advancing their insurgency and their sort of radical Marxist-Leninist approach to conquering the state and, you know, sort of, or you know, sort of seizing the state and introducing sort of revolutionary socialism. But then that, you know, that fizzles out because of repression and other factors, and then you have, you know, immediately this turn to neoliberalism, right? And so it's a kind of a pretty narrow understanding of politics in the late 1960s, 70s, and early 80s. And so my aim here is to sort of expand the realm of the political, to kind of take the critiques of development as a kind of window into these sort of other ways in which people imagined their, you know, communities, their place, their relationship to the state, their sort of place in this sort of hegemonic narrative of modernization and development, right? That's both outside the state modernization and outside of neoliberalism. So I think I'll end there. I will say just one more thing, that I think there's like some interesting contemporary implications as well. in that, if we look at the Latin American left today, I think we see these fissures emerging, whether it be Ecuador or Chile or Mexico, and emerging and hardening, right? Where it's like you've got the sort of state, the politics of like where you have to control the state and you have to kind of still think in terms of developmentalism, right? You have to be, the state has to be there to guide modernization through extractivism, through big infrastructure projects. And so they're sort of still within the state developmentalist framework. And then you have an assortment of other folks, movements that are advancing, alternatives, whether you want to call it post-developmental, or, you could use other terms to describe them, but, where the center is sort of on the kind of, okay, the local knowledge, the local expertise, the local experience, the autonomous governance. And you see that from Mexico, you see that in the recent election in Ecuador. And so I think there's something that we need to figure out how these things came about historically. Right, so I'll end there.
Thank you. Well, we have some time for questions. I want to ask the first one, if I may.
Yeah, please.
So this was Tenochtitlan, like around the time of 1521, and that was the lake. So this is the original outline of the lake.
Yeah.
And then by, 1865, it shrinks to about here.
Yeah.
And then in 1905, it shrinks to about there. So you can see this whole area, how this has become land, right? And that is partly the kind of connection to like all of the dust storms that are, taking place in this reclaimed kind of land. So it's like a centuries in the making kind of, what is that called when you do landfill?
Reclamation.
Reclamation of land and landfill. Associated with kind of various things that's led to the shrinking of the lake. So my question for you, Matt, was to tell us, one of the things that I found so interesting about your presentation is how on the one hand, it's so invested in looking at the way even the things that we don't tend to think of as being infused with politics, like nature, obviously as being like the first kind of thing you think of as the opposite of like the political, as this kind of passive sort of recipient of whatever politics people do. And you're really animating that. You're really kind of showing how like, the dialectics, if you will, of nature and the city really show how everyone is everyone or everything is an actor, is an actant, is participating in these kind of dynamics. I wanted to sort of turn the camera on you and sort of ask you about like whether there is an ethical dimension that comes into the consciousness of the historian's task in the work that you do, which can be reduced to something quite, something so simple as like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this work? To maybe a more like kind of wider reflection on like, what are the what is the consciousness that a historian does or should not, bring to bear upon this object of history that they're studying, understanding, of course, that this is something that happened a long time ago or it happened in the past in any case, understanding that this is something that's available only through like documents and kind of secondhand research as well as hearsay and legends of the past. And you're kind of putting it together and reanimating it. Do you see yourself as being propelled by a reason to do this, or is there some investment or thing that you, or is the historian's task really to be kind of completely sort of separated and devoid of that in order to have a faithful picture of whatever it is that you're researching?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question about sort of ethics and research and the purposes of history, right? And I think, I think a lot of historians have a tendency to kind of distance themselves from these sorts of ethical, political questions about, their own research. And I think part of it stems from among some historians, and maybe this is subsiding now, but a kind of tendency to avoid any connotation or accusation of presentism, right? It's like, we study the past, and like we have to have the most objective eyes on the past as we can. We can't be influenced by, presentist concerns. And to me, that's like really bogus. I don't know. I just don't identify with that at all. In a sense, like in part because like, of course you're driven by like of course, like the questions you ask, of course, are enmeshed in all kinds of concerns of the present, politics, culture, what you think is going to be interesting for other people to read, what you find interesting, all has to do with the present. So I find that a little bogus. And so, an environmental history as a field emerged because of present concerns. I mean, it dates back to the 1970s, the apex of the environmental movement in the U.S. And so, I'm very much in that kind of tradition of thinking, of kind of conceiving of my own research as being deeply implicated in the sort of struggles of today about the right to the city, right? So like urban popular movements and what they can accomplish given the conditions of whatever city they're in, political, environmental, cultural conditions. Of kind of also excavating, these histories from oblivion, right? And sort of presenting people, and I go down and give talks in Mexico City, and that to me is the most important. I mean, this is great also, of course, but like, to me, that's why I'm doing this, is so that I can go and talk to people at the UNAM in Mexico City, to talk to people in different environmental organizations, right? There are certain contexts that I still want to make, and conversations and connections I still want to develop, and conversations I want to have. But to have those opportunities to go down and talk to like scientists, ecologists in Mexico City, about nature in Mexico City and how it's political and how it's about power relationships, right? To kind of get them outside of their thinking about like, the sort of this kind of sort of like ecology as separate, right? Ecosystems as separate from humans, or humans only impact them and destroy them, and then it's outside power relationships in some way. So I want to kind of like my purpose is to kind of bring those stories and those approaches to people's attention, and then see what they do with them. But yeah, my research is I'm driven by, particularly in this project, but also in the one I just talked about, like I'm driven by these concerns of the present, right? Like in the second project, like how do we construct and I consider myself part of the broadly construed the left, like how do we construct a left in Latin America that can both that can respond to people's needs and not be kind of alienating of so many, and that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the left of the past, but also but also have an impact, right? So like another, kind of some of the issues of the sort of movements that are focused on autonomy, self-governance, and so on and so forth, is that it's not clear to me what their theory of change is, right? If you're working outside of the state, it's not clear like how you're going to confront the power relationships that have defined Latin America for so long. Anyway, I don't want to ramble, but that's,
Well, it
that's
seems
my
to
answer.
speak not only to the case of Mexico and other countries, but the United States as well. I mean,
Mhm.
it's a very interesting
Yeah.
parallel that you're drawing here with the United States.
I was just going to ask, you mentioned Peña Nieto and the project of the airport that now has been stopped and whatnot.
Right.
But what do you say to the effect of the Tren Maya that AMLO wants to build? Because it's another ecological...
Ecological, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, right. So, I think what I try to do in my research and teaching is interrogate these kinds of concepts of what sustainable is. What does sustainability mean, and like how do people use it or like kind of wield it for different political purposes? And so like Tren Maya fits into that, right? Just like the airport was, the narrative was that this is like an environmental design building, and it's like part of Mexico's sort of push for it to be a global city and a sustainable global city. And the Tren Maya, right, is different geography, but similar kind of thing. It's like it's going to be somehow it's going to protect the forest and can protect the ecosystem, but it's also going to it's sort of like this green growth idea, at least for some. And yeah, I mean the Tren Maya would be a disaster. Would be a disaster, and to me it's another one of these state modernization projects that it fits in the sort of neoliberal capitalist mold, and that is disastrous for people. While kind of like, in a sense, kind of like brings more people within market relations, it like subsumes people into market relationships, right? There's jobs, right? Jobs within capitalism. So it kind of brings people into the sort of market relationships of capitalism, without actually addressing their human needs.
When you said rescuing histories from the oblivion, that really resonated with me because some of my understanding of the development of Mexico City comes from a book I read in undergrad by Jose Emilio Pacheco, Las Batallas en el Desierto.
Yes.
Anyway, that kind of really struck me how the PRI, especially in indigenismo, but also in their kind of top-down approach to development, it really wiped out kind of every time there's a new development project, oftentimes it wiped out kind of the lives of the people that used to live on the land before them and things like that, and that kind of leads me to this question of if PRI has always had this kind of historical tendency towards like a technocratic top-down approach on like development, how is that going to change potentially now that their almost century-long rule on power has at least been interrupted? How might that look with people like AMLO in the future going forward?
I mean, that's a good question. I'm not really sure how to answer that question. I mean, I have some thoughts, but I'm curious what you think of your own question, if you don't mind me like throwing it back at you.
No, I think there might be some changes,
Mhm.
some changes in how perhaps people will start to be included a little bit more. I think AMLO perhaps is a bit more beholden to the people being a populist than perhaps the PRI, who they kind of just at least in most of their kind of having power, they kind of just pointed to who was going to be the next president and kind of had this technocratic kind of cabal running things. And AMLO being beholden to these things, being beholden to kind of popular opinion more so than perhaps the PRI, maybe that has some hope, but at the same time, in kind of coming into this government after these many years of the same party, I believe that, you know, he's left with a lot of problems that aren't going to be able to be fixed. He's going to still have to use kind of a top-down approach, one that maybe often bypasses checks and balances. I think he's going to have to lay some of the idealist stuff that got him elected perhaps to the side in order to deal with the problem of, you know, development and how do you keep the advantage going? How do you keep the modernization going and the good effects going? Because I think we have seen a lot of good effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's a huge question. I'm not a huge fan of AMLO. I'm very concerned with the way he and Moderna have been governing. I think we can recognize some of the things that he's done, like certain social benefits, raising the minimum wage, particularly around the border, those kinds of things. But I mean, he's got all of these fossil fuel projects, and I think it's the same kind. He's reproducing these, and it's hegemonic, right? It's kind of this logic of development that leads to the same kinds of deleterious consequences that we've seen for so long. At the same time that he, castigates and excoriates the, environmental justice advocates around the country, and so I think there's a lack, and I'm gonna not being Mexican, but being pretty familiar with, the way a lot of sort of people on the left, particularly in Mexico, think. I think there's a lack of an imagination for something different, right? For a different kind of political project. And so people on the left tend to sort of side with AMLO because he's being attacked by the right. He's being attacked by the panistas and all of that. And it's, I just feel like there's a lack of any kind of political imagination for a new kind of left. And I don't have any answers, but I think there's a tendency to kind of it's like, oh, now we have our president. And it's like, do we? Do we have our president? Is this really what we want? Is this really what we believe in, what we fight for? I think there needs to be more room for critique and more room for maneuver and thinking differently and organizing differently. So yeah, I mean, I'm kind of stuck between, in a way. I'm stuck between the sort of those who still want to kind of make sure they take state power and, build, of course, have policies that redistribute wealth and that, this and that. Of course, that's very important. Material development, who doesn't want that? But there has to be we have to think sort of differently about how that can take place, and also how it's historically been done has been so devastating for so many, including of ecosystems. So,
thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it? Yeah. I think it's time.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Really busy guy. One of the things I forgot to actually add in Professor Vitz's resume is that he's also the director of the Global South Studies program. So if any of you are interested in that, or interested in the program and the things that they're doing over there, please feel free to get in touch with him. I hope you don't mind if I send you an email and